Stop what you're doing right now and look at the front line in Ukraine because something has changed. For almost 18 months, Russia pushed. Slowly, brutally, village by village, tree line by tree line, field by field. It was not fast. It was not brilliant. It was not the dramatic breakthrough Moscow promised. But it was constant. Russia kept throwing men, shells, glide bombs, drones, tanks, armored vehicles, and money into the war. And for a long time, that pressure bent the map in Russia's favor. Not by much each week, but enough. A few hundred meters here, a ruined settlement there, a road junction, a trench system, a burned-out village that Russia could claim as another victory on state television. That was the rhythm of the war. Russia attacked. Ukraine defended. Russia lost thousands of men. Ukraine bled to slow them down. And the line kept creeping west. Then something happened. The momentum started to break. Russia was still attacking. Russian soldiers were still dying. Russian artillery was still firing. Russian drones were still hunting. Russian missiles were still hitting Ukrainian cities. But the old pattern began to crack. Russia was no longer simply grinding forward and forcing Ukraine backward. Ukraine started taking land back. Ukraine started hitting deeper. Ukraine started disrupting the systems Russia needed to keep attacking. And suddenly, the war Putin thought he could win by exhaustion began turning into something much more dangerous for Moscow. A war Russia could no longer control. This is the story of how Ukraine broke Russia's 18-month offensive without needing one giant counteroffensive. No huge armored spearhead. No single dramatic breakthrough. No Hollywood-style liberation campaign. Instead, Ukraine did something smarter. It attacked the machinery behind Russia's advance. The logistics, the fuel, the communications, the railways, the oil refineries, the recruitment system, the propaganda narrative, the illusion that Russia could keep pushing forever. And that is why Putin should be worried. Because Russia's biggest strength was never elegance. It was endurance. Russia believed it could absorb more pain than Ukraine. It believed it could accept more dead soldiers, more destroyed equipment, more sanctions, more inflation, more diplomatic isolation, and more internal pressure than Ukraine and its allies could handle. That was the bet. Putin did not need a brilliant army if he had a stubborn one. He did not need a clean victory if he could force a dirty one. He did not need a breakthrough if he could grind forward long enough for Ukraine to run out of money, weapons, air defenses, troops, and patience. But Ukraine is now attacking that bet. Ukraine is making endurance expensive for Russia. And that changes everything. For much of 2025, the war looked like it was still in Russia's favor. The Russian army was not racing across Ukraine, but did not need to. It was applying pressure across multiple sectors, forcing Ukraine to defend constantly, and using mass to grind down positions. Russian commanders accepted insane losses because the Kremlin could still claim progress. That is how attrition works. You do not need to look good. You just need the enemy to run out first. And for a while, that looked like Putin's strategy. Russia would push through exhausted Ukrainian positions. It would use glide bombs to smash defenses. It would send infantry forward again and again. It would rely on drones to hunt vehicles and artillery. It would keep Ukrainian brigades stretched across a massive front line. The Russian offensive was ugly, but ugly can still be dangerous. The problem for Moscow is that this kind of war requires a huge machine behind it. Every Russian assault depends on a long chain of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, railways, communications, replacement troops, repair crews, drones, electronic warfare teams, command posts, and political pressure from the Kremlin. Ukraine understood that. And instead of trying to beat Russia only where Russia was strongest, Ukraine started attacking the parts of the machine Russia could not easily replace. That is where the war began to change. Look at the front line first. Russia's gains slowed dramatically. Reports indicated that Russian ground advances in May were tiny compared with the scale of Moscow's effort. Ukraine's military leadership claimed that Ukrainian forces had recaptured hundreds of square kilometers in 2026, and independent mappers also reported that Russia's total advances had slowed or even reversed in recent months. That does not mean Ukraine has won the war. It does not mean Russia is harmless. It does not mean the front line is easy, but does mean the pattern changed. For the first time in a long time, Russia's grinding machine was no longer producing the same result. And that is where the real question begins. Why? Why did Russia's offensive slow down after so many months of pressure? Why did Ukraine start regaining momentum? Why did a Russian war plan built on endurance begin to look so fragile? The answer is not one single thing. It is a chain reaction. Bad weather made exposed terrain harder to cross. Tree lanes became killing grounds. Drone surveillance made movement dangerous. Russian units that depended on digital communications and improvised systems became more vulnerable when connectivity and coordination were disrupted. Ukrainian strikes hit railways and supply routes. Drone attacks reached deeper into Russian logistics. Refineries and fuel infrastructure came under pressure. Recruitment costs kept rising, and Russian propaganda had to keep pretending that everything was going according to plan, while the system underneath, it looked increasingly strained. That is how an offensive breaks. Not always in one explosion. Sometimes it breaks because every part of the machine becomes slightly worse at the same time. A convoy arrives late. A unit attacks without enough coordination. A fuel shipment is delayed. A railway node is hit. A drone team loses connection. A replacement unit is poorly trained. A refinery strike causes supply stress. A commander cannot get accurate information. A propaganda claim stops matching battlefield reality. Then the offensive still exists on paper, but it no longer moves the way it used to. This is what Ukraine is trying to do to Russia. It is not only fighting Russian soldiers, it is fighting Russian momentum. And momentum is everything in an attrition war. Russia's strategy depends on making Ukraine feel like the pressure will never stop. Every day, another assault. Every week, another village. Every month, another piece of territory. The point is psychological as much as military. Moscow wants Ukraine to believe that the front line will keep bending until something finally snaps. Ukraine's response is to make Russia feel the same pressure in reverse. Every month, more drone strikes. Every month, more refinery fires. Every month, more fuel anxiety. Every month, more difficult logistics. Every month, more expensive recruitment. Every month, more proof that Russian territory is not fully safe. That is how Ukraine flips the burden of time. Russia wanted time to exhaust Ukraine. Ukraine is making time exhaust Russia too. And this is where drones become the key. Ukraine's drone war is no longer just about battlefield videos. It is not only about FPV drones diving into tanks or soldiers in trenches. Those matter, but the bigger transformation is that drones have expanded the battlefield far behind the front line. A road is no longer safe just because it is behind Russian lines. A depot is no longer safe because it is dozens of kilometers away. A refinery is no longer safe because it is deep inside Russia. A port is no longer safe because it is far from the trenches. A railway junction is no longer just infrastructure. It is a target. This is the war Russia did not prepare for. Russia prepared to fight a large conventional war where its mass would eventually overpower Ukraine. But Ukraine created a war where mass becomes a vulnerability. The bigger the army, the more fuel it needs. The more fuel it needs, the more refineries matter. The more supplies it needs, the more roads and railways matter. The more troops it sends, the more recruitment pressure rises. The more equipment it moves, the more convoys become targets. Ukraine is attacking the weight of Russia's war. That is why Russia's slow advance began to lose its power. Because slow advances still require fast logistics. A Russian assault may move only a few hundred meters, but the supply chain behind it is enormous. Shells have to move. Food has to move. Drones have to move. Batteries have to move. Wounded soldiers have to move back. Replacements have to move forward. Fuel trucks have to keep arriving. Commanders need communication. Railways need to function. Depots need to remain stocked. If Ukraine makes that system unreliable, Russia's advantage shrinks. That is the real battlefield. And it is exactly where Ukraine has become more dangerous. Take fuel. Fuel is the bloodstream of Russia's invasion. Tanks need it. Trucks need it. Generators need it. Logistics vehicles need it. Engineering vehicles needed. Air defense support vehicles needed. Even troops who never sit inside an armored vehicle depend on fuel, because everything behind them moves through a fuel-fed system. Ukraine has understood this better and better. That is why Russian oil refineries, depots, and fuel networks have become major targets. These strikes are not random. They're not just revenge. They are part of a strategy to weaken the war economy behind the army. If Russia cannot refine fuel efficiently, the army feels it. If fuel prices rise, the economy feels it. If regions impose fuel limits, civilians feel it. If refineries need repairs, the state feels it. If air defenses are moved to protect energy infrastructure, other targets become more exposed. That is the trap. Russia's oil system once looked like one of its greatest strengths. It funded the state. It supplied the army. It gave Moscow leverage. It helped Putin believe he could outlast sanctions and Western pressure. Ukraine is turning that strength into a target set, and the effects are spreading. Reports have described fuel shortages, rising gasoline prices, regional rationing, and pressure on Russian refinery output after Ukrainian drone attacks. Even Russia's own financial authorities have had to acknowledge fuel production risks and inflation pressure connected to disruptions. That matters because the war is no longer only draining tanks and artillery shells. It is pressing into the economy that keeps Putin's system stable. That is why Ukraine's strategy is so dangerous for Moscow. It connects the battlefield to the gas station. It connects drone strikes to inflation. It connects refinery fires to public frustration. It connects the war in Ukraine to daily life inside Russia. Putin wanted the Russian public to experience the war through television. Ukraine is making them experience it through shortages, prices, smoke, delays, and uncertainty. That is a major shift. Now, look at communications. Modern warfare depends on information. A commander needs to know where his units are, where the enemy is, where drones are flying, where artillery is available, and where supplies are moving. If communications are poor, an army becomes slower and more vulnerable. Russia has relied on a messy mix of military communications, civilian apps, improvised networks, telegram channels, commercial internet access, and field-level workarounds. That kind of system can function, but it is fragile. If connectivity is disrupted, if messaging is throttled, if units cannot share real-time information, then coordination suffers. And when coordination suffers in a drone-heavy battlefield, people die. A unit that cannot coordinate moves into a kill zone. A convoy that cannot get warning drives into a strike. A commander who cannot see the battlefield sends troops into danger. An artillery crew without timely targeting data becomes less effective. A drone team without stable communication loses tempo. That is another way Ukraine can break Russia's offensive without needing to crush every assault head-on. Make Russia slower. Make Russia blind. Make Russia uncertain. Make Russia act with worse information than before. The same logic applies to railways and logistics hubs. Russia's military depends heavily on rail. Railways move ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and men across enormous distances. Trucks finish the job closer to the front, but rail is the backbone. If Ukraine can disrupt rail lines, bridges, transfer points, depots, and routes feeding the front, the entire system slows. A delayed train becomes a delayed assault. A damaged railway node becomes a shortage. A disrupted logistics hub becomes a weaker front line. Again, the effect is not always instant. It is cumulative. That is the key word. Cumulative. Ukraine is not looking for only one spectacular strike. It is building layers of pressure. One layer at the front, one layer behind the front, one layer in Crimea, one layer inside Russia, one layer in the energy system. Russia's 18-month offensive did not collapse because of one mistake. It weakened because Ukraine attacked the entire system behind it. Logistics, fuel, railways, communications, recruitment, drones, and propaganda. Russia can survive one crisis at a time. But when fuel shortages, refinery fires, stalled attacks, rising recruitment costs, and Ukrainian deep strikes all happen together, the war becomes harder to hide and harder to sustain. Putin believed time favored Russia because Russia was bigger. But time only helps the side that adapts. Ukraine adapted faster. It turned Russian mass into Russian waste. That is why this phase is dangerous for Moscow. Ukraine may not need one huge counteroffensive. It can make Russia's offensive slower, costlier, less coordinated, and less sustainable until it begins collapsing under its own weight. Not because it runs out of soldiers immediately, but because every soldier becomes harder to supply. Not because it runs out of fuel immediately, but because every leader becomes harder to deliver. Not because propaganda disappears immediately, but because every claim becomes harder to believe. That is the slow break. And Russia's 18-month offensive may be entering that stage. The next question is whether Ukraine can keep the pressure on. That depends on drones, air defenses, Western support, domestic production, intelligence, electronic warfare, and the ability to keep hitting the right targets. Russia will adapt. Russia will move air defenses. Russia will harden facilities. Russia will reroute logistics. Russia will intensify attacks. Russia will try to regain momentum. This is not over. But the old assumption that Russia can simply grind forever is weaker than it has been in a long time. Ukraine has shown another path. Do not fight Russia only where Russia is strongest. Hit the roads behind the assault. Hit the fuel behind the roads. Hit the refineries behind the fuel. Hit the railways behind the depots. Hit the communications behind the command. Hit the economy behind the army. Hit the narrative behind the politics. That is how Ukraine broke the offensive. And if this continues, Russia's problem will not be that it loses one battle. It will be that it can no longer afford the war it chose. That is the nightmare for Putin. Because once an offensive stops producing gains, it starts producing questions. Why are we still dying? Why are fuel prices rising? Why are refineries burning? Why are recruitment bonuses increasing? Why are Ukrainian drones reaching deeper? Why is the map no longer moving? Why did the war that was supposed to prove Russian strength start exposing Russian weakness? Those questions are dangerous. And Ukraine is forcing more of them into the open. For 18 months, Russia pushed. Then Ukraine changed the battlefield. Now the offensive that once looked relentless is starting to look exhausted. And if Moscow cannot restart the machine, Putin's war may not end with a sudden collapse. It may end with something even worse for Russia. A slow realization that the country spent everything it had to move a line on a map that no longer wants to move. But this is only one part of the story. Because while Russia's ground offensive is losing momentum, Ukraine's long-range drone campaign is reaching deeper into Russia's oil system, hitting the fuel infrastructure that keeps Putin's invasion alive. And that may be the next disaster Moscow cannot hide.